The Arizona desert stretched endlessly under the burning afternoon sun. Dry winds carried dust and memories across the lonely plains where few dared to settle anymore. But Samuel McCoy had lived there most of his life, first as a cattleman, then a husband, and finally a widower with no one left to talk to but his old horse in the whispering wind. His ranch, Silver Creek, sat miles away from the nearest town. The paint had peeled from the house, the corral fence leaned with age, and the once bustling barn stood silent. Samuel's hands were rough, his back bent from years of ranch work, but his eyes, sharp blue, still carried a glimmer of life. Every evening, he sat on his porch, rocking slowly, pipe in hand, staring at the horizon as the sun dipped behind the red mesas. That was the only time the desert looked alive, when it turned gold and crimson, as if remembering better days. His wife, Mary, had loved those sunsets. After she passed, the sky lost its meaning for him. The silence afterward was heavier than any storm. Samuel had grown used to solitude. He didn't mind the quiet, or so he told himself. The world had moved on. The railroads had replaced cattle trails, the towns had grown, and the young men had gone off to new lives. But he stayed, guarding a piece of land that felt more like a ghost of the past. One late evening, dark clouds rolled in from the west. The desert smelled of rain, a rare, almost forgotten scent. Samuel looked up, watching the lightning crawl across the sky. He muttered to himself, "We're in for a good one tonight." He stabled his horse, shut the barn door tight, and went inside to light the old kerosene lamp. Then came the knock. At first, it was faint, like something the wind might have caused. He ignored it. Then it came again, harder this time. 3 sharp raps against the wooden gate. Samuel froze, his hand still on the lantern. No one ever came out here, not this far. He reached for his Winchester rifle, the same one he'd carried during the Indian skirmishes years ago. Slowly, he opened the door. Through the rain and dust, he saw 5 figures standing near the gate. Women, Apache, by their clothing and the dark braids glistening with rain. Their faces were streaked with mud, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. The oldest one, maybe in her 30s, stepped forward and raised her hands, speaking in broken English. "Please, shelter," she said. "Soldiers, they come. Burned our home. We have nowhere." Samuel hesitated, his heart thumped loud in his chest. He'd seen trouble like this before. Raids, revenge, endless cycles of violence between settlers and tribes. And here, 5 women were asking him to take them in. If the cavalry found them here, he could be accused of harboring fugitives. He stared at them, the rifle still in his hand. The rain poured harder, soaking their torn dresses. The youngest, barely more than 16, shivered uncontrollably. One of them held a child, no older than 3, wrapped in a ragged blanket. Samuel's jaw tightened. He looked past them into the black desert where lightning flashed like a warning. He could send them away, close his gate, pretend he never saw them. That's what a smart man would do. But he wasn't a smart man, just a tired one with a heart that still remembered kindness. "Come in," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. The women exchanged glances, then hurried inside as the wind howled. Samuel guided them to the barn first, the warmest place on the property. He lit another lamp, the glow revealing their faces more clearly now, frightened but proud, scarred by loss. He fetched blankets, water, and what little food he had left, cornbread, some beans, and a bit of jerky. They ate slowly, carefully, as if not used to being safe. When the storm finally calmed, Samuel sat on a stool near the fire, studying them quietly. The oldest woman introduced herself as Taya. She knew a few words of English, enough to explain that their village had been attacked by a troop of soldiers chasing runaway Apaches. Her husband and brothers were gone, either killed or scattered. They had been walking for 2 days, following the canyon trails until they stumbled upon his ranch. Samuel listened in silence. The more she spoke, the more he realized the war wasn't as simple as the newspapers claimed. These weren't raiders or rebels, just survivors. "Rest here tonight," he said finally. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out what to do." The women nodded gratefully. When he returned to the house, Samuel felt something he hadn't felt in years, the presence of life around him. The sounds of soft voices, the crackle of fire, even the faint cry of the child in the barn. They all reminded him of what his home used to be. He sat by the window long after midnight, staring at the glow from the barn and wondering what Mary would have done. By morning, the desert looked new again, washed clean by rain. He went out early to bring them breakfast, and to his surprise, the women were already awake, working. One was fetching water from the well, another cleaning the barn floor, two were helping each other repair torn clothing with bits of thread. Even the young girl smiled shyly when she saw him. "You don't have to work," Samuel said, setting down a basket of biscuits. Taya shook her head. "Work good," she said simply. "You help us, we help you." He nodded slowly, almost smiling. As the days passed, their presence filled the empty ranch with new sounds, laughter, song, and the rhythm of life returning. The women tended the garden, cooked meals, and even mended Samuel's old shirts. They learned his routines, and he learned their words. They taught him Apache phrases. He taught them how to ride horses. For the first time in years, Samuel found himself talking again, about his wife, his youth, the old cattle drives. He even laughed one evening when the child tried to feed his horse a biscuit. But not everyone would see it that way. In nearby towns, whispers spread fast. Travelers passing through had seen 5 Indian women, living with an old rancher out by Silver Creek. Some called him a fool, others called him a traitor. Samuel didn't care. For the first time since Mary's passing, the house felt alive again. And deep down, though he wouldn't admit it, he knew this peace wouldn't last. The desert always remembered its storms, and another one was coming soon. The weeks turned into months, and the once forgotten Silver Creek ranch began to breathe again. The sound of laughter replaced the lonely creak of the windmill. The smell of stew and baked bread drifted through the air where only dust used to linger. Samuel McCoy felt younger somehow. His mornings began with the women already working, mending fences, washing clothes, and feeding the horses. He had tried to convince them to rest, but they refused. Work, for them, was a way to stay alive. The leader, Taya, had a quiet strength about her. Her dark eyes held both pain and calm, the kind only those who'd lost everything could carry. She became Samuel's bridge to the others. Bit by bit, her English improved, and Samuel learned a few Apache words in return. He found himself talking again, something he hadn't done in years. He told her about Mary, his late wife, about the old days when cattle drives stretched for miles and the rivers still ran clean. Taya listened silently, her gaze soft. Sometimes, she'd tell him stories of her people, tales of the mountains and the spirits that guarded them. The young girl, Lonnie, helped Samuel. In the stables, she had a spark of energy that reminded him of his own daughter, who had died young, long before the wars. Lonnie would hum as she brushed the horses, her hair glistening in the sunlight, her voice like a bird after rain. Little by little, the walls Samuel had built around his heart began to fall. The women became part of his daily rhythm, part of the land itself. He no longer thought of them as guests, but as family. Yet, outside the ranch, trouble brewed. The townsfolk in nearby Fort Bisbee had started whispering about the Indian camp on McCoy's property. Some said he'd gone mad in his old age. Others accused him of harboring enemies of the U.S. Army. The sheriff, a proud man named Walt Hensley, had once worked cattle with Samuel years ago, but even he couldn't ignore the talk forever. One afternoon, while Samuel and Taya repaired a section of fence, a group of riders appeared in the distance. Dust rose behind them like a brown cloud. Samuel squinted and muttered under his breath, "Well, hell." Taya froze. "Soldiers?" she asked. Samuel nodded slowly. "Looks that way." The 5 women hurried into the barn, their faces pale. Samuel stood by the fence, leaning on his rifle as the riders drew closer, 6 cavalrymen, the stars and stripes stitched to their sleeves. The leader, a tall lieutenant with polished boots and a cold smirk, stopped his horse in front of the old rancher. "Morning," Samuel greeted calmly. "Morning," the lieutenant replied, his eyes scanning the property. "Name's Lieutenant Briggs. We're looking for some escaped Apache women. They were seen heading this way a few weeks back." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You mean refugees?" The lieutenant ignored the correction. "They're government property now, prisoners from Fort Apache. You've seen anything suspicious?" Samuel's grip on the rifle tightened slightly. Ain't seen anyone suspicious. Just me, my horse, and a bunch of cows that don't listen. Briggs smirked. You sure about that, old man? We've had reports. Samuel's eyes narrowed. Reports lie sometimes. The soldiers exchanged glances. Briggs leaned forward in the saddle. If you're hiding them, you're breaking federal law. That's aiding hostiles. Samuel didn't move. His voice was low, but sharp. You listen here, Lieutenant. Ain't nobody hostile on this ranch but that storm you're bringing. Now, unless you've got proof, I suggest you take your men and ride on. Briggs chuckled, dismounting. You always were a stubborn old fool, McCoy. He started toward the barn, but Samuel stepped in his path. Don't. The moment stretched long and tense. Even the horses seemed to sense it. Finally, Briggs sighed and motioned to his men. Fine, but we'll be back, and if I find out you're lying, his eyes flashed dangerously. You'll wish you weren't. The soldiers turned and rode off, their dust cloud trailing behind them. Samuel stood there until they disappeared over the ridge. When he turned, Taya was standing by the barn door, her eyes wet. They come back, she whispered. Samuel nodded grimly. They will, but they'll have to go through me first. That night, the fire burned bright in the ranch house. The women sat quietly, fear shadowing their faces. Samuel loaded his rifle, checked the windows, and looked out at the desert. I'll protect you, he said finally, his voice steady. This is your home now. Taya looked at him with something between gratitude and disbelief. Why? She asked softly. Why help us? Your people. They hate ours. Samuel's eyes drifted to the picture of Mary on the wall. Because hate took enough from me already, he said. I ain't lettin' it take any more. The words hung in the air, heavy and honest. Over the next few days, they prepared quietly. Samuel showed the women how to use old tools, where to hide if the soldiers returned, and how to signal him if trouble came. The desert wind carried whispers of approaching danger, but life went on, because it had to. And then, one morning, the horizon turned to dust again. Briggs came back, this time with 10 men. Samuel saw them from the porch, his rifle already slung across his shoulder. The women gathered behind the door, silent. Samuel McCoy, Briggs shouted. By order of the U.S. Army, you're under arrest for harboring fugitives. Samuel stepped out, the sun glaring behind him. You'll have to shoot me first. Briggs smirked. Don't tempt me. The soldiers began to dismount. But before they could move closer, a voice rang out, Taya's. She stepped forward, her hands raised high. We go, she said shakily. No fight. We go with you. Samuel turned sharply. No, you won't. Taya's eyes filled with tears. They kill you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the quiet authority of a man who'd spent his life facing storms, he said, I've lived long enough. But not long enough to be a coward. The lieutenant sneered. Last warning, McCoy. Samuel lifted his rifle. You got yours. The standoff stretched like a wire ready to snap, and then, a gunshot cracked through the air. Dust, shouting, chaos. When the smoke cleared, Briggs lay on the ground, clutching his arm. One of his men dragged him to safety. The rest hesitated. None of them wanted to be the one who shot an old war veteran defending women and children. Finally, they retreated. The sound of galloping faded into the distance. Samuel stood on the porch, the rifle still in his hands, his breathing ragged. Taya ran to him, her face streaked with tears. You safe? She whispered. He nodded slowly, lowering the rifle. We all are, for now. That evening, the sunset painted the desert in gold again. The women sat outside the house, singing softly, a song Samuel didn't understand, but somehow felt deep in his bones. As he listened, he thought of Mary, of the long years of loneliness, and of how life had given him one last purpose, not to fight wars, but to protect peace. From that day on, Silver Creek Ranch became a sanctuary, not just for the 5 women, but for anyone the world had